I want you to just close your eyes for a second. Picture a calendar on the wall. The page is flipped to July 1991.
It's hard to even imagine the atmosphere.
Exactly. You're walking down these corridors in the North Block in New Delhi where the finance ministry is. To the outside world, the summer heat is the only thing that seems to be oppressing the city. But inside those offices, the air is just freezing cold with panic.
It was a moment of absolute paralysis. You can feel it even reading the reports from that time.
We aren't talking about a recession where you just tighten your belt for a bit. We're not even talking about a stock market dip. We are talking about a nation of nearly 900 million people checking its wallet and finding, well, basically nothing but lint.
The foreign exchange reserves, and you have to understand, this is the actual hard currency. The dollars that India needed to buy petrol, diesel, essential machinery from the rest of the world, it had just evaporated.
Evaporated is the right word. To put a number on it, the reserves had dropped to a level that wasn't even enough to cover a fortnight of imports.
2 weeks.
Yeah.
Just 2 weeks.
Can you wrap your head around that? That is all that stood between India and a complete shutdown of its transport and industrial sectors.
It's a terrifying prospect. Imagine the trucks just stopping on the highways, the factories grinding to a halt.
And beyond that, the country defaults on its sovereign debt. Being broke is one thing, but defaulting, that's a whole different level of crisis. It makes you a pariah in the global economy.
It does. Nobody lends to a defaulter. You're cut off.
So prices of essential goods were already skyrocketing because of the scarcity. Inflation was just eating away at whatever savings the middle class had managed to scrape together. The country was, effectively standing on the edge of a cliff, staring down into the abyss.
It really sounds like the plot of some geopolitical thriller.
It does. But for India, this was the stark reality. And that specific moment of terror, that absolute crisis, it became the catalyst for one of the most significant shifts in the country's entire history. We are talking, of course, about the economic turning point of India, the new economic policy of 1991.
That was the year the old rule book was. Well, it was basically thrown into a bonfire and a new one was written from scratch.
And that's what we're here to talk about. Today, we're going to do a deep dive into the NCERT Class 11 economics textbook, specifically Chapter 3, which is titled Liberalisation, Privatisation, and Globalisation, an Appraisal.
But we aren't just, reading a textbook out loud. We're going a lot deeper.
Exactly. This deep dive is laser-focused on the full summary for UPSC, as presented by the Simplified UPSC by PPP YouTube channel.
Which, I have to say, is a goldmine. If you're trying to wrap your head around these complex economic shifts, especially for competitive exams like the UPSC, their breakdown is just stellar, really clear.
It really is. So before we jump off that cliff with you into the 1991 crisis, I do have a humble request for everyone listening. Please, if you find this useful, go and subscribe to the Simplified UPSC by PPP channel.
It makes a huge difference.
It really does. And if you're capable, if you find a real, tangible value in this kind of deep analysis, please consider supporting them on Patreon. It's the fuel that keeps this super useful content engine running.
And on that note, we have to give a massive, heartfelt shout out to all the current supporters. You folks are the reason this content actually gets made. Your support means the world.
Absolutely. Also, engagement matters a lot. Like this audio, share your valuable comments, tell us what you think. It helps more than you know. And here's a pro tip for all the serious learners out there.
Oh, this is the good stuff.
Free notes with practice PYQs. That's previous year questions for the uninitiated, are available right now on their Telegram channel.
And for the power users, the people who want to go even deeper, there is a private Telegram library. That gets you access to all the videos in this series, organized premium notes, extra PYQs, and even model mains answers.
It's the full package. You just need to DM the public Telegram channel to get into that inner circle.
Right.
Okay, housekeeping done. Let's get back to the edge of that cliff. We know the what involves that famous acronym, LPG, Liberalization, Privatisation, Globalisation. But I really want to start with the why. Countries don't just go broke overnight. You don't wake up one Tuesday and realize, oh, we have billions in debt. How did India get into this mess?
It was a slow burn. It wasn't a sudden event. To really understand the crash of 91, you have to look at the management, or let's be honest, the mismanagement of the 1980s. The source material is quite polite about it. It calls it inefficient management.
Inefficient feels like a massive euphemism for disastrous.
It's a bit of an understatement, yes. The root cause was a fundamental mismatch in the government's checkbook. You see, a government generates funds through a few ways: mainly taxation and by running public sector enterprises, your PSEs.
Sure.
But throughout the 1980s, government expenditure began to consistently exceed its revenue, and not by a little bit, by huge, unsustainable margins.
Okay, but lots of governments run deficits. I mean, that's not necessarily a crisis in itself, is it?
True, but the critical question is, what are you spending that borrowed money on? If you borrow to build a factory or a port or a highway, that asset will eventually generate income to help pay back the loan. It's an investment.
Right. It creates future value.
Exactly. But India was trapped in a cycle of borrowing to finance consumption. We were borrowing just to keep the administration running, to pay salaries, to fund subsidies that weren't creating new assets.
So it's kind of like using a credit card to pay for your groceries and your rent month after month.
That is the perfect analogy.
And then getting a second credit card to pay off the minimum balance on the first one.
You've just described a debt trap. That's exactly what it was. We were borrowing from banks, from our own people through bonds, and from international financial institutions.
Yeah.
But we weren't generating any new income streams to actually service that debt.
And then the import cover crisis hits. What made it specifically a dollar crisis? I mean, why couldn't we just print more rupees to pay for the oil?
Because, simply put, Saudi Arabia doesn't want rupees. They want dollars. International trade runs on hard currencies, primarily the U.S. dollar.
And you get those dollars by selling your stuff to the world.
Precisely. You earn dollars by exporting your own goods. But in the late 80s, our imports were growing rapidly. We needed oil, technology, advanced machinery, but our exports weren't keeping pace at all. Our goods just weren't competitive enough on the global stage.
So the dollar reserve, that national wallet, just starts shrinking.
Drastically. It got to the point where, as we mentioned at the start, we didn't have enough foreign exchange to finance our imports for more than 2 weeks. But it gets worse.
How does it get worse than that?
We didn't even have enough dollars to pay the interest on the loans we had already taken. That's when the alarm bells start ringing for international lenders.
Of course. So the lenders see this. They see a country that's borrowing just to pay interest with no real export growth to back it up. They must have panicked.
They pulled back. Hard. Nobody wanted to lend to India anymore. We looked like a terrible bet. India was completely cornered. No one would give us a loan.
So what do you do when the local banks won't touch you? You go to the lender of last resort, the big guys.
Exactly. India had no choice but to approach the IBRD, which is popularly known as the World Bank, and the IMF, the International Monetary Fund. The government went, cap in hand, and asked for a bailout.
And they got it right. I think the figure was around $7 billion.
They did receive $7 billion as a loan to manage the immediate crisis. But as you know, in the world of international finance, there's absolutely no such thing as a free lunch, especially not from the IMF.
There was a quid pro quo.
A massive one.
Yeah.
The IMF and the World Bank essentially sat India down and said, look, we'll bail you out. We'll give you the cash to survive this week and the next. But your current economic model, this closed, state-controlled, license-heavy system is broken. It's what got you here.
So they were holding the check hostage until we agreed to fundamentally reform.
You could definitely say that. They expected India to liberalize and open up its economy. They wanted restrictions on the private sector removed, the role of the government dramatically reduced, and all the trade barriers dismantled.
And so India agreed to these conditionalities, as they're called, and announced the new economic policy, or the NEP. Now, the NCERT text makes a point of distinguishing between two types of measures within this policy. Is this just academic jargon, or does that distinction actually matter?
Well, it matters immensely. Think of it like a patient arriving in the emergency room having a heart attack. The doctors have to do two things at once, really. First, they have to stabilize the patient.
Right. Stop the immediate crisis.
Exactly. Get the heart beating rhythmically again, stop the immediate pain, make sure they don't die on the table. In economic terms, that's what the NEP called stabilization measures.
Okay, so that's short-term, stop the bleeding.
Correct. The immediate goals were to correct the balance of payments crisis. Basically, get enough Forex so we don't default next week, and to bring inflation under control because prices were just soaring.
Makes sense. But you can't just send a heart attack patient home after stabilizing them.
You absolutely cannot. You can't just send them home to live the exact same lifestyle of stress and bad food that caused the heart attack in the first place. You need a lifestyle change.
Diet, exercise, maybe even surgery.
Exactly. And those are the structural reform measures. These are the long-term policies aimed at improving the fundamental efficiency of the economy and removing the rigidities that caused the problem. This is where our famous acronym, LPG, comes in. Liberalization, Privatization, and globalization.
All right, let's unpack that first one then. Liberalization. To me, that word implies that before 1991, the economy was, what, imprisoned?
Shackled is the word you often hear.
Yeah.
And it's not far from the truth. We lived under what was known as the license raj.
The license raj, it sounds so archaic.
It was. Imagine if you wanted to start a company to make, say, shoes. You couldn't just go buy some land and start making shoes. You needed a license from the government to even exist. Now, what if you were successful and wanted to expand production from 50 pairs of shoes a week to 100? You needed another permission from the government. If you wanted to import a new, more efficient stitching machine from Germany, you guessed it, another permission.
That sounds absolutely exhausting, and I assume it just creates a massive breeding ground for corruption and delays.
Massive corruption. And it killed speed. It killed innovation. By the time you finally got the license you needed, the market opportunity might have completely vanished. So liberalization was introduced to put an end to all these restrictions. And the most dramatic shift was the deregulation of the industrial sector.
Right. The source material mentions that industrial licensing was abolished for almost all products.
Almost is the key word there. They did keep a small negative list.
Hmm.
You still needed a license for a handful of strategic or sensitive industries.
Like what?
Things like alcohol, cigarettes, hazardous chemicals, industrial explosives, electronics, aerospace, and drugs and pharmaceuticals.
Which, to be fair, I think most people are okay with. I don't really want my neighbor manufacturing TNT in his garage without some kind of permit.
Agreed. There's a clear public safety rationale there. The state has to maintain that responsibility. But beyond that very short list, the shackles were off. Entrepreneurs could finally start businesses based on market demand, not government permission.
Another huge change you mentioned was the reduction in the public sector reservation. What does that mean exactly?
This refers to industries that were previously told only the government can operate in this space.
Ah, okay.
Before 1991, a vast number of industries were reserved solely for the government. The private sector was legally barred from entering. The reforms reduced this list drastically. Today, the only industries that are still primarily reserved for the public sector are parts of defense equipment, atomic energy generation, and railway transport.
Wow, that is a massive shift. It's basically the government saying, you know what, we have no business making bread or building watches. Let the market do that.
That's the core philosophy. And along with that, they also let the market determine prices for many goods.
Right. In many industries, the government used to fix the prices.
Yeah.
That was removed. The market's simple supply and demand was allowed to set the price.
Now, liberalization wasn't just about factories and products. It hit the financial sector too, which is just as if not more, important.
The banks, the plumbing of the entire economy.
Exactly. This is a favorite topic for exams, by the way. The role of the RBI, the Reserve Bank of India, underwent a fundamental identity crisis. It shifted from being primarily a regulator to being a facilitator.
What's the difference in practice? What does that mean for a bank on the ground?
Well, as a regulator, the RBI would micromanage everything. Banks had to ask for permission for almost every significant decision. What interest rates to offer, where to open new branches, what kind of loans to give. It was incredibly stifling.
And as a facilitator?
As a facilitator, the RBI sets the broad ground rules, the safety parameters, the capital adequacy norms. But within that framework, the banks have the autonomy to make their own commercial decisions. They could compete.
And this must have opened the door for new players to enter the market.
It absolutely did. The reforms led to the establishment of private sector banks, both Indian and foreign. This is when you started seeing the rise of the HDFCs and ICICIs of the world, which are now giants.
And it also allowed foreign institutional investors, or FIIs, to invest in Indian financial markets, right? So foreign money could come into our stock market.
Yes, which brought in a huge amount of capital and expertise.
Okay, let's move on to something that affects everyone's wallet directly. Tax reforms. Now, the government desperately needed money, so my first instinct would be to raise taxes. Why did they lower them? That seems completely counterintuitive.
It does seem that way, but it's based on a piece of economic theory, often associated with the Laffer curve. In the pre-reform era, tax rates in India were punishingly high. We're talking top marginal income tax rates, well over 80 or 90% at times.
Wow.
And when the government tries to take that much, people don't stop earning. They just stop declaring what they earn. It led to massive tax evasion and the growth of a huge black economy.
So the theory was lower the rate and increase the compliance.
Precisely. The reform theory was that if you lower the tax rates to a more reasonable level, you encourage better compliance. People are far more willing to pay a 20 or 30% tax than to risk jail time to evade an 80% tax. The idea is that a lower rate on a much bigger declared base can actually bring in more revenue.
And speaking of taxes, it's interesting that the NCERT source specifically mentions the GST, even though that came much, much later.
It does. It notes the Goods and Services Tax Act of 2016, which became effective in July 2017. It's framed as the logical culmination of this entire process of simplification and rationalization that began in '91. The goal was to create one nation, one tax, one market.
Right. Now let's talk about the currency itself. The whole crisis was triggered by a lack of dollars. How did the reforms fix that specific problem?
It was a two-step process. The first was an immediate emergency measure, devaluation. The government intentionally and officially lowered the value of the rupee against foreign currencies like the dollar.
Hang on, why would you want to make your own money worth less? That sounds like a bad thing.
It sounds bad, but it's a tool to fix a trade imbalance. If the rupee is cheaper, it means a dollar can now buy more Indian goods. An American importer can suddenly buy more Indian cotton or spices for the same amount of money.
Ah, so it makes your exports cheaper and more attractive.
Exactly. It gives a quick boost to exports and brings those desperately needed dollars into the country. But that was just the short-term fix. The second step was more permanent. They moved toward a market float.
Meaning the government stops being the one to decide what a dollar is worth every morning.
Precisely. Instead of direct government control, the demand for and supply of currencies in the market determines the exchange rate. It's more flexible and responsive to the real economy.
Which brings us neatly to trade and investment policy. This really feels like the moment India stopped trying to be an economic island and decided to join the world.
That's a perfect way to put it. They began to systematically dismantle the quantitative restrictions on imports and exports.
Quantitative restrictions, that's just a fancy term for quotas, right? Like, you can only import 100 tons of this particular chemical this year.
Yes, exactly. Those were largely removed. They also removed export duties. We used to tax our own exports, which made them more expensive for foreigners. Getting rid of that made our goods more competitive.
And this brings us to a really interesting connection with the UPSC syllabus, the PYQ linkage you mentioned.
Ah, yes, the previous year questions. There's often a focus in the exams on the concept of import substitution.
This was the policy before 1991, right?
Yes. For decades, our policy was inward-looking. We tried to produce everything ourselves, from cars to computers to save precious foreign exchange. We protected our domestic industries with incredibly high tariffs and those import quotas we just talked about.
Which sounds quite patriotic on the surface. Buy Indian, make in India.
It sounds great on a bumper sticker, but economically it led to inefficiency and stagnation. Without any real competition from abroad, domestic industries had no incentive to improve quality or reduce costs. I mean, why would you bother making a better car if you're the only company allowed to sell cars in a country of 800 million people?
Good point. You get a captive market and become complacent.
Utterly complacent. Liberalization was the necessary antidote to that. It forced Indian industry to face global competition. The new mantra was, compete or perish.
So that's liberalization in a nutshell. Unshackling the beast. Now let's talk about the second pillar of LPG. Privatization. This one always seems to stir up a lot of debate.
It certainly does. At its core, privatization means shedding the ownership or the management of a government-owned enterprise. The big buzzword you'll always hear in this context is disinvestment.
Which critics often call selling off the family silver.
That's the most common critique, yes. Disinvestment specifically refers to the government selling off part of its equity, its shares, in public sector enterprises, PSEs, to the public and to private institutional investors.
But again, the question is why? If the government spent decades building these massive companies, steel plants, airlines, telephone companies, why suddenly give them up?
The rationale provided in the text and by the government at the time is essentially about financial discipline and efficiency. The belief was that private capital and, more importantly, private managerial capabilities could improve the performance of these units.
How so?
Well, government managers often lack the direct incentive to maximize profit because their jobs are secure regardless of the company's performance. There isn't that same pressure from shareholders. The idea was that private management would be more agile, more innovative, and more focused on the bottom line.
But they didn't just sell everything off indiscriminately. They were strategic about it. They kept what they called the jewels.
This is a very important nuance. The government realized that some of its PSEs were actually performing quite well. They were profitable and efficient. The strategy for these companies wasn't to sell them, but to unleash them.
So they gave them more autonomy, not less.
Exactly. They identified the most efficient PSEs and gave them special status to help them become global players. This is the whole concept of the Navratnas, or the 9 jewels.
Box 3.1 in the NCERT text details this. It really sounds like a hierarchy of corporate nobility.
It is, in a way. You have the Maharatnas. These are the absolute giants, like the Indian Oil Corporation and the Steel Authority of India, SAIL. Then you have the Navratnas companies like Hindustan Aeronautics Limited, HAL, and Mahanagar Telephone Nigam, MTNL. And finally, the Miniratnas, which includes companies like BSNL, the Airport Authority of India, and IRCTC.
And the point wasn't just to give them a fancy title to put on their letterhead.
No, not at all. The title came with real power. It granted them significant operational autonomy. These companies could suddenly make massive investment decisions, enter into joint ventures, and raise money from global markets without having to wait for a file to move through 10 different government ministries in Delhi. The goal was to let them compete on the world stage.
However, the source material is fair and does offer a strong critique of privatization. It's not all presented as sunshine and efficiency gains.
No, and it's crucial to look at the other side of the coin. One of the main arguments from critics is that the assets of these PSEs were often undervalued when they were sold to the private sector.
Meaning they were sold for cheap.
Essentially, yes. The argument is that the public lost out on the true long-term value of what they collectively owned. It was seen by some as a transfer of public wealth into a few private hands at bargain basement prices.
And what happened to the money the government did make from these sales? Where did those proceeds go?
That's the other major criticism. Ideally, if you sell a productive asset like a factory, you should use that money to build another productive asset like a school, a hospital, or new infrastructure. But very often, the proceeds from disinvestment were used just to offset the government's revenue shortage.
So they basically sold the factory to pay the electric bill for the year.
That's a great way to put it. It didn't go into building new social infrastructure for the future. It was used to plug the recurring holes in the annual budget.
All right, let's move to the third and final pillar, globalization. This is the one that arguably changed the cultural and social landscape of India more than anything else.
I would agree with that. Globalization is defined in the text as integrating the economy of the country with the world economy. It's about breaking down barriers and, in theory, turning the world into a borderless world or a global village.
And for India, the biggest and most visible outcome of this was outsourcing. Suddenly, Bangalore wasn't just a city, it became a verb in the West. I'm sorry, your job has been Bangalored.
India became the back office of the world. But you have to ask, why us? Why India? The text pinpoints the magic combination: low wage rates plus a large pool of skilled manpower.
The demographic dividend.
Exactly. We had millions of English-speaking graduates who were well-educated and could work for a fraction of the cost of their Western counterparts. It was an unbeatable value proposition for global companies.
And it wasn't just call centers answering phones, though that's the common stereotype. It became much more sophisticated.
It started with voice-based business process outsourcing, or BPO, but it expanded rapidly. It moved into record-keeping, complex banking services, music recording, film editing, and even high-end work like medical transcription and clinical advice. The IT and IT-enabled services sector became the flagship of India's integration with the global economy.
But it's important to note this wasn't a one-way street with foreign companies just coming here. The source lists some specific Indian companies that went truly global.
Yes, Box 3.2 mentions this. It's not just about foreign companies coming to India. It's about Tata Steel buying Chorus and operating in 26 countries. It's HCL Technologies setting up offices around the world. It's Dr. Reddy's Laboratories becoming a global pharmaceutical player. These are Indian multinationals. That is globalization in action.
Yeah, you can't talk about globalization without talking about the referee, the rule keeper of global trade, the WTO.
The World Trade Organization. It was founded in 1995, and it's the successor to something called GATT, the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, which was set up way back in 1948.
And what's its official mission?
Theoretically, the goal is to establish a rule-based international trade regime. They want to ensure that trade flows as smoothly, predictably, and freely as possible. The idea is to promote optimum utilization of world resources.
But the NCERT text raises a pretty significant controversy here. It asks the question, is the game rigged?
That is the big question, and it's a major point of contention. The source specifically mentions that developing countries, including India, often feel cheated by the WTO framework.
Wow, so.
We are forced to open our markets to goods and services from developed countries. We have to lower our tariffs. But at the same time, developed countries often find ways to keep their own markets closed, particularly in agriculture, by providing massive subsidies to their own farmers.
So to put it simply, we have to lower our tariffs on, say, American corn, but the U.S. government pays its farmers billions of dollars to produce that corn cheaply, which then floods our market and puts our local unsubsidized farmers out of business.
That is the essence of the complaint. It creates a fundamentally uneven playing field.
Speaking of opening our markets, this connects directly to a specific previous year question from the UPSC exam.
Yes, looking at the PYQ linkage from the provided source, there's a question regarding FDI in multi-brand retail.
This is the whole Walmart debate, right? Whether to let big foreign supermarkets into India.
Exactly. The question asks you to discuss the impact of allowing foreign direct investment into the multi-brand retail sector, specifically on supply chain management and on commodity trade patterns. It's a classic globalization dilemma.
So on the one hand, you have the argument for efficiency.
Right. Big global retailers like Walmart or Tesco bring in cutting-edge technology, logistics, cold storage chains. This could dramatically reduce the massive amount of post-harvest food waste we have in India.
But on the other hand, what happens to the little guy?
That's the flip side. On the other hand, you have millions of small kirana shops, the mom-and-pop stores that are the backbone of local communities. Can they possibly compete with a global giant that has immense purchasing power? The fear is that FDI will wipe out the livelihoods of millions of small traders.
So if you're a UPSC aspirant writing an answer to that, you have to weigh those two things against each other, efficiency versus equity.
Precisely. You have to connect the big theoretical concept of globalization to the very practical, real-world reality of a neighborhood shopkeeper.
Okay, so we've covered the three pillars: liberalization, privatization, and globalization. Now we need to look at the report card. This brings us to Section 5. Indian economy during reforms. An appraisal. 30 years on, did the gamble pay off?
Well, if you just look at the headline number, the GDP growth rate, it looks like a resounding, unqualified success.
The data cited in the book is pretty stark. It says GDP growth increased from an average of 5.6% in the 1980-91 period to 8.2% in the 2007-12 period. That is a massive jump. We became one of the fastest growing major economies in the world.
He did, no question about it. But a good economist always has to look under the hood. You have to ask, where did that growth actually come from? And the data shows a massive sectoral skew.
A skew, meaning it wasn't balanced.
Not at all. The growth was driven mainly, almost overwhelmingly, by the service sector.
Right. The IT campuses in Bangalore, the financial services in Mumbai, the telecom boom, the shiny air-conditioned offices.
Yeah. Now, look at the industrial or manufacturing sector. It had very fluctuating growth. It actually faced a slowdown at times, partly because of those cheaper imports we talked about. When you open the doors to global goods, your local factories feel the heat. There was also a problem of inadequate investment in infrastructure.
And the biggest loser in all of this?
Agriculture. Without a doubt. Growth in the agricultural sector actually declined post-reforms. You have to remember, this isn't just an abstract sector of the economy. It's the direct livelihood of the majority of the Indian population.
This leads directly to a very worrying phenomenon that the text calls jobless growth.
That is the great paradox of the Indian growth story. While the GDP pie got much, much bigger, employment generation did not keep pace. Because the sectors that grew the fastest, like IT and finance, are capital-intensive and skill-intensive. They require highly educated workers and a lot of technology, but they don't employ millions and millions of people in the way that low-skill manufacturing or agriculture do. So GDP went up, but job creation lagged far behind.
Let's dig a bit deeper into that agriculture crisis. Why did it suffer so much in an era of high growth?
It was a case of benign neglect, really. The text points out that public investment in agriculture infrastructure, things the government is supposed to build, fell sharply. We stopped building as many irrigation canals, power grids for rural areas, market roads, and research facilities.
And what about the input costs for farmers, the subsidies?
That was another blow. Fertilizer subsidies were removed or significantly reduced, which directly increased the cost of production, especially for small and marginal farmers. At the very same time, we reduced import duties on agricultural products, so our farmers were suddenly facing competition from heavily subsidized farmers in the U.S. and Europe.
So their costs went up and they faced cheaper competition. A double whammy.
A complete double whammy. And the entire focus of policy shifted, didn't it?
Yes. The export-oriented policy meant there was a big push for farmers to shift from growing traditional food grains like wheat and rice to growing cash crops for export,
Things like cotton, spices, flowers.
which links them directly to the volatility of global prices.
And that's a huge risk. If you're a farmer in Maharashtra and the global price of cotton crashes because of a bumper crop in the U.S., you're ruined. You're no longer insulated by the domestic market.
This is where the PYQ linkage on land reforms becomes so relevant.
Absolutely. The question from the 13G's 3.pdf source talks about the difficulties in designing and implementing agriculture-friendly land reforms. The key point is that the 1991 reforms did nothing to address the fundamental, pre-existing inequality in land ownership in rural India.
And the Green Revolution had already shown that technology benefits those who own land.
Precisely. The Green Revolution increased yield, but without proper land reform, most of the benefits went to large farmers, while the vast population of small farmers and landless laborers were often left behind. The 1991 reforms did little to change that basic structure.
And sadly, this isn't just about economic shorts and growth percentages. There is a very real, very tragic human cost to all of this. The text includes a very somber box 3.3, about the Sircilla tragedy.
It's a heartbreaking and powerful example. In the state of Andhra Pradesh, power sector reforms were implemented, which led to a steep hike in electricity tariffs. The idea, from a purely economic standpoint, was to make the power sector financially viable by charging market prices.
But the power loom weavers, these are small-scale textile workers. They couldn't afford the higher electricity rates. Their looms were their livelihood.
Their entire production cost went through the roof, but the price they got for their cloth didn't change. It created an acute livelihood crisis. And tragically, this led to a situation where 50 weavers committed suicide in the single town of Sircilla.
50 people. That is just a stark reminder. When we sit in air-conditioned rooms in Delhi or Mumbai and talk about efficiency and rationalizing prices, there are real people at the receiving end of those bills.
It illustrates what the text calls the negative result of reforms. The welfare of the poor can be compromised in the pursuit of fiscal balance and market efficiency if there aren't adequate safety nets.
The text also touches on the broader social impact, on inequality in consumption.
Yes. The reforms, by opening up the economy, definitely encouraged a culture of consumerism. We saw a boom in the availability of goods that catered to the urban rich and the growing middle-class air conditioners, cars, designer clothes, mobile phones.
Well, as we've discussed, the vital sectors that affect the poor, like basic health, primary education, and agriculture, lagged behind in terms of investment and focus.
It created a kind of dual India. One part of the country was integrated with the global economy, shining and prosperous. The other part, largely rural and agricultural, was left struggling to catch up.
So we've arrived at the conclusion. After looking at all of this, the crisis, the reforms, the growth, and the pain, how do we synthesize it? Was 1991 a good thing or a bad thing for India?
I think we have to take a balanced view. The source material is very clear on this. The reforms of 1991 undoubtedly saved India from an immediate and catastrophic crisis. They built up a strong foreign exchange reserve. We never had to worry about a fortnight of imports again. They unleashed the IT prowess that put India on the global map. These are huge achievements.
There's always a but.
But they largely failed to address the basic fundamental problems of employment and agriculture. And they widened the economic disparities between the rich and the poor, and between urban and rural India. The market, as it turns out, is great at creating wealth, but it's not so great at distributing it equitably.
It seems like the great challenge for the next generation of policymakers is to figure out how to keep that engine of growth running, but fix the distribution, how to get both growth and equity.
That is the central tension of India's story post-1991. And if I could, I'd like to leave the listener with a provocative thought to mull over.
Please, go for it.
Consider this. Market-driven globalization clearly expands markets for developed countries. They get to sell their iPhones and their sodas and their movies to our billion-plus population. But does it, in the process, compromise the unique identity and the long-term welfare of developing nations? Are we shaping the global economy, or is the global economy shaping us in its own image?
That is a very big and a very important question. And before we wrap up, there's one more connection to the future that we should touch on. The PYQ linkage mentions things like acid rain and e-waste.
Yes. Sources like 13CSPU1.pdf and BBRO MHTA bring up environmental issues. This is the next frontier, sustainable development.
A globalized, high-growth economy consumes massive resources. We have mountains of electronic waste piling up from all those gadgets we imported and now use. We have industrial pollution that leads to things like acid rain.
So the argument could be made that the 1991 reforms fixed the financial crisis of that era, but they might have inadvertently accelerated the environmental crisis of our era.
Exactly. The great challenge for the post-1991 economy is bridging that growing gap between economic growth and environmental degradation.
Well, that brings us to the end of this incredible journey. We started with the empty government coffers of 1991. We walked through the halls of the IMF. We saw the tearing down of the license Raj. We sold off some Navratnas. And we ended up in a globalized, outsourced, service sector-dominated India.
It's been quite a ride through 3 decades of change.
A massive thank you to everyone for listening. And once again, please do subscribe to Simplified UPSC by PPP on YouTube. It is an absolute treasure trove for anyone serious about understanding modern India.
And if you can, please consider supporting their mission on Patreon. It truly makes a huge difference to the creators who put in all this work.
Like this audio and please leave a comment. Tell us what you think. Were the 1991 reforms ultimately fair? And don't forget about all those resources.
That's right. Join the private Telegram library for those organized premium notes, the extra PYQs, and the model mains answers.
You just need to DM their public Telegram channel to join. Until next time.
Keep learning and keep questioning.
We'll see you in the next deep dive.